Before we open this up to you, I just have a few questions for our distinguished speakers. Let me begin with Maximo. Maximo, you talked about market failures and you talked about trade policies. Given the current situation in China and the macro fundamentals, and as well as in Brazil and Argentina, what role macro policies have played in terms of aiding the poor in conjunction with these agriculture policies that you talked about?
Okay, so I think we have the story of Brazil, which there was significant public investment, as it was explained before, and created a significant change, especially in inclusion. And agriculture was a key element in those policies. But at the same time, we are observing significant issues in the macro policies of Brazil and how sustainable these types of reform are. So that comes back again to the argument of, okay, how sustainable policies that imply subsidies and we cannot sustain over time could complicate the fiscal part of the government and therefore make policies more complex. And one of the things that we have produced, Eugenio Diaz Bonilla, which is around here, he just finished a book trying to bring on all the lessons on how the interrelation between macro policies and agriculture, which is essential, and normally you don't see the finance ministers talking with agricultural ministers, which is something that is extremely important, together, for example, to the exchange rate issue. Now, trade policies and macro policies also are related, and something that we observed clearly in the 2007 crisis was the immediate reaction and response in trying to protect borders, with the idea of having enough food for their own communities. And there is an asymmetric issue. So if a big importing country does a trade barrier or creates import taxes and so on, or creates a policy that restricts the flow of goods, that will have significant effect. It's similar with key exporting countries. What happened with Argentina, that put some barriers to export, create a significant effect and exacerbation of the effect of the prices. What we observed in the 2007-2008, for example, is that the increase in prices was basically double because of all these policies that were put in place. So at the end, we need to be very careful on the small, medium, and large countries and how these can have negative distributional effects as a result of the policies being implemented.
Thank you, Maximo. I now have a question for Alberto. Your work, has been on the indirect taxation of agriculture has been kind of seminal, and we've done a lot of work since that. And the chart that Maximo put out showed that implicit taxation is just moving away. We are moving towards more of subsidy regimes in developed and developing countries. So, in your context, in the early 90s and the late 80s when this work was being done, how did this impact poverty directly? How did it allow us to get to the poverty issue, smallholders and urban and rural poor? How did the understanding that you showed really played a role at the field level?
Yes. See how trade and macro policies affect the poor. The effect, I think, is, as some of the evidence has shown, is very, very powerful. You see, for one, public and private investment in agriculture will be very sensitive to the incentive framework. You do any social project evaluation, and whether or not you invest in public investments in agriculture, what's the social rate of return? And of course, there you have a whole price structure. The farmer themselves, of course, he can invest in farming, but then you have capital that can flow into agriculture or can flow out of agriculture. Labor can move in and out. And so again, so the returns affect very much. And so the effect ultimately, I think, is not only just a static figure I gave of 30% of agricultural income, below what it would have been without interventions, for 20 years, year after year after year. So it's significant. But the effect on employment, you see, the value of labor productivity, for example, for the small, medium, and large farms, is very directly affected by this structure of incentives, which is not only agricultural policies, it's the whole package of the relative incentives.
Yeah. Thank you, Alberto. Yes, Peter, you want to add to that?
Could I just give one concrete example? 1978, Indonesia was trying to decide whether to devalue the rupiah or revalue the rupiah. They had oil revenues, but they were suffering from Dutch disease. The rice sector was the most labor-intensive and was reasonably well protected. The second most labor-intensive industry was smallholder rubber, which was virtually out of business because the exchange rate was so unfavorable to exporting rubber. The president was persuaded to devalue the rupiah substantially, and within 2 weeks, employment in the smallholder rubber industry doubled, redoubled, came back to normal. In less than a year, we had an enormous impact on poverty.
Thank you for bringing that out, Peter. That was wonderful. Now I move on to Ross. Ross, you've talked about the protection in developed and developing countries. And can you give us some concrete examples on how this limits the potential of the poor and smallholders to participate in global markets? We heard quite a bit about commercial agriculture in the success stories this morning. So if you could elaborate on that, that would be.
I think the most important single example, most dramatic in recent times, was one that was much studied by IFPRI, and that was the food price crisis of 2007, 8, 9, where as prices began to rise through across the global economy, many countries which were food exporters restricted their exports to protect domestic prices. And that exacerbated the flow of price increases elsewhere. This happened in many parts of the world. Perhaps the most severe example was between Bangladesh and India, where India, at the time, that was before the wonderful, some of the wonderful developments in recent times, but the restrictions on exports in India greatly exacerbated the price problem in Bangladesh. So that's the most dramatic recent example.
Thank you. Leanne, you left us with a question, so I have a question for you. The trade agreements have always been controversial. In fact, they've been renamed as partnerships, economic partnerships, not free trade agreements anymore. How can we politically convince people that these are in the interest of smallholders and poor people? Whether it is TPP or TTIP, TPP, for example, in the context of Vietnam, or maybe to some extent on rice in Japan, TTIP to a lot of new accession countries to EU. So how can we convince policymakers and countries that these are beneficial to small and poor landless workers?
Right, so in the WTO, we always say we're a member-driven organization, right? So I think part of that means that the messages that work are the messages that are targeted to what countries can hear, right? So I'm not sure that there's a single message that, like we've been talking about systems all morning, right? You have to sort of see how the pieces fit together. My perspective is our large members really have a responsibility to stay engaged in the multilateral system. And by large members, I mean large members generally, not just developed countries. So to use the system and to engage in it effectively. And if the flip side of that is that our smaller members also need to be able to use the system effectively. And one of the issues that I think has come up in the past decade is that the world is moving so fast, and the WTO hasn't kind of caught up the way, its nimbleness. Yeah. It needs to work on its nimbleness, and so part of that is related to how policymakers, how quickly they can adapt to the changing conditions. And I think arguably one of the issues with the Doha round is that we're stuck in 2007 when the world is 2015. And so we need new approaches and sort of an open-mindedness of our members to think that through.
Thank you, Leanne. Let's thank those panelists again for a wonderful discussion.